record. It's on. We are recording. Good. Okay. I wanted to start at page 85. Just wanted to go over that. I don't think I explained that very well. If we can go back to page 85. And the currency exchange rates. I wanted just to go over this again. Actually, let's go to this. This is fairly basic. I wanted to go to page 80. Oh, is that 80? 84. Page 84 here, and that's the currency trade in Japanese Japanese yen, and how. How the quantity of Japanese yen, that it shifts out the demand curve, and let's see this. And looking, okay. So the balance of payment surplus in Japan relative to so that the supply that a balance of payment surplus in Japan. That means that Japan is investing more abroad relative to the peso. So that increases. I'm going to have to go back and think about this because I'm just right now. I've gone over this. Let me come back to this again. I want to go over that, and it's funny at the moment. I'm a bit. I got confused about that. Anyway, let me go over that again, and I'll get back to you on that. We'll start. Let's go to page 108, and. We'll talk about. I want to talk about the Japanese asset bubble, and I think that the importance of this event, of course, for those of you that are from you're from this country, this event has had a tremendous impact. This event had a tremendous impact on the economy of Japan and really changed the Japanese economy. Now, this is around the time that you were born, so you've grown up in a world that is post asset bubble. So you grew up in a world that is completely different than what than in terms of the economic growth in this country than what I experienced of what was going on in Japan as I was growing up. When I was very young, Japan was like what China would eventually become. All of the when I was very young, it was the place that you had all the cheap toys. All of my the toys came from Japan, and they were cheap. Whereas in China, maybe the 1990s, cheap stuff came from China. Then transistors. Transistors came. Sony became a powerful company. You had transistors. You had automobiles in the late 1960s, 1970s. The Japanese economy was growing very, very rapidly. In the 1960s, 1970s, and through most of the 1980s, the Japanese economy grew like what the Chinese economy has grown for the past almost 30 years now, and there's certainly a question about the Chinese economy whether that's going to continue. So about 25 that like 25-30 year period, Japanese economy grew very, very rapidly. One of the things I want to so we had a rapidly growing economy. But the thing on page 108 that's very it's very important here is I want to show the general, the balance of payments, the Japanese balance of payments from 1955 to 1988. Now, 1955, in the early 1980s, you can see that it's actually zero. You can see that it goes basically nearly zero. It's right around, there's the 0% line right there. And if you look at that, you'll see that it's up and down, just up and down, that's percentage of GDP. That is as a percentage of GDP. So you'll see it's actually quite in a fairly narrow band and slowly upward, maybe a very, very slow upward trending, but pretty close to zero. In other words, that there was Japan's trade with the rest of the world was about even. Japan's exports and imports were very similar. There was very little flow of capital into Japan because of currency controls. So there were a lot of currency controls. It was difficult to move money out of Japan, and not attractive to invest in Japan. The investment needs were satisfied by domestic savings. So domestic savings were very high, and so that satisfied the demand for investment capital during that rapid growth period, and that was used to finance the rapid growth in Japanese manufacturing. During that period. The country grew very rapidly. So that was the picture that you had through the early 1980s. So early in the 1980s then, you began suddenly, and you suddenly see it's 1984, you had some very momentary in the early 1970s. And this in fact was during, if you look, this is 1971. And it went to positive 2.5%. The interesting thing there was 1971 was when you had the crisis, was the year of the crisis where the world was forced off of what we call a de facto gold standard. So currency rates were fixed until then, and then suddenly the world went to a floating exchange rate regime. So you'll see that, but other than that, it's very close, very just small up and down around zero, and then suddenly it jumps up in the early 1980s. Now, one of the things that happened then was, in fact, the United States began running a very large trade deficit, and its government began running a very large fiscal deficit, and some people think, in fact, that caused this relationship to change. Now, what's interesting about that is that when this was happening, and certainly one of the things about my country is that quite often when something doesn't quite go right, we quite frequently blame somebody else for it. And in this case, what was quite possibly an American problem, the blame was put on Japan. So you had this you had this surge and around this time, then the Japanese trade surplus with the United States surges. The United States blamed that on Japan, but as we can see, there was very little. The Japanese trade was roughly in balance, and the balance of payments were roughly in balance, and that line is very close to zero throughout that period. It's only towards in this period that changes. So now the reason why that's important, this is something that happened more than 30 years ago. You say, well, why would that matter? Because the response to that is what triggered the Japanese asset bubble, and this was what was called the Plaza Accord. This is a very famous economic event in world economic history, because at that time, and as I say in what I write here, if you were alive in 1985, and I was, you in reading in the press reports of the United States, Japan had a massive balance of payment surplus of the world for decades, But as you go back here, you see that wasn't the case at all. And so the U.S. thought the solution was, well, Japan has to increase the value of the yen to the dollar. Now, at that time, the value of the yen to the dollar was fixed at 360 yen to the dollar. Now, the reason why it was fixed at 360 yen, has anyone ever told you why it was 360 yen?
No.
Exactly. 360, very good. Yes, that was the reason. It was 360 yen to the dollar from the end of the war, and it was fixed at that rate from 1945 until the 40-year period. And as you say, the reason was that one of the American that was involved with the occupation decided the circle was 360 degrees, so he made it 360 to the dollar. So that was the exchange rate. He might as well have gone and asked for guidance from the gods or something. But that was it. So it was thought in 1985 that was too low. That the yen was too inexpensive relative to the dollar. And what that meant was that this would have to drop. And so what the Plaza Accord did, the Plaza Accord said, okay, there's going to be a coordination between the major powers. That was at the time West Germany. This was before the collapse of East Germany and the Soviet Union, and so Germany was divided into West and East Germany. And so these five countries, West Germany, France, the U.S., Britain, and Japan, intervened in the currency markets to force the value of the Japanese yen up, and it was a coordinated adjustment. And in fact, the yen very quickly went to somewhere around 180 to the dollar. So it went. So that was like a 50, 180, maybe some. I'll have to check exactly, but it went up quite substantially relative. The dollar declined substantially relative to the yen, and now what was interesting was it didn't really do very much to the trade surplus. It actually had very little impact on the trade surplus, but it did have a major impact on the Japanese economy. And what it did was that for the first time in 40 years, suddenly the yen has increased in value relative to the dollar. And now at the same time, 1984, Japan relaxes all of its currency capital controls. So the end of capital controls. So now people are Japanese are free to invest abroad, and one of the important facts of that is that because the capital controls, the end of the capital controls, now the yen is increasing in value, which means now that the yen is more valuable. So, but also because of the increase in the value of the yen, that made Japan's exports more expensive. So the Ministry of Finance was very worried that and the Ministry of Trade were very concerned that Japan would experience a serious recession as a result. That growth would slow, and because of that concern, they decided that they needed to encourage investment in Japan. So what they did was they reduced interest rates. So the interest rate was reduced. Let's see if I have. Yeah, there's the interest rates here. You look on page 114, and what happened was so in the mid-80s, this is like 84. The Plaza Accord is right here. The yen rises in value. Interest rates are steadily cut. They were over 7%. They're cut to 5%. Short-term interest rates are cut to 3.5%, and they stay that way throughout the rest of the 1980s. So what that did, so what that did was that it encouraged. It encouraged, and also at the same time, the banks were put under pressure to increase their lending. The banks were told, lend more money. Okay, lend more money. The manufacturers were to lend money to the manufacturers. Manufacturers can borrow as much money as you need in order to expand and invest in production. And the idea was to increase the manufacturing efficiency, so that to reduce the cost of the price of manufacturing, so that the companies were more efficient, so that even though the yen was increased in value, the Japanese products would be competitive in international markets. That's what they were thinking. So, but the problem was that the manufacturers didn't have enough. There wasn't enough need for investment, as there was all this pressure to lend. The banks are out calling everyone up and telling them to borrow money. To understand this, what was going on, and to understand what happened, you have to understand the relationship at that time between the land market, and the ability and companies' ability, company investment. After the war, from the war, basically Japan was destroyed. The country was completely. The only thing that was basically left was the people and the land. And so there was very little investment. There was very little savings. And one of the things that was the decision that the Japanese government made in the early years after the end of the war was that they were going to not borrow money from abroad. Okay. And one of the reasons why was because Japan looked and said, well, they saw how other Western countries historically took advantage of countries that they invested in. And so they were Japan was very wary. They were very concerned about allowing foreign investment and having the industries taken over. So in order to basically, and the idea was to preserve Japanese sovereignty, and the only way you could do that was that the investment had to come from within the country. But you also had to decide so there was very little capital. So you also had to decide who was going to get that capital. Who was going to be, there's very scarce capital. You weren't going to allow foreigners to invest, other than what the United States did with the Marshall Plan, so that there was the aid to rebuild the country in the early years after the war. But other than that, there was no direct foreign investment. So how did they decide? The government decided that who was going to get the investment? The people who owned land. And companies owned land. So so you had to own land in order to borrow money from the banks. And so you own land, that's collateral. Do you know what collateral Collateral is that if you borrow money from the bank will want some guarantee that they'll be able to get repaid. That's called collateral. Collateral, C-O-L-L-A-T-E-R-A-L. Collateral. So if I buy and a company, and the collateral, basically the only collateral you could use, because there was nothing, was land, dirt. So if you owned dirt, you could borrow. So the companies that owned land were able to borrow in order to build factories and rebuild the country. And one of the things, for example, when you, and you still have this practice now, if you rent, if you lease like office space, you have to pay a large deposit. It's usually about typically 6 to 12 months. That's gone down, but historically that's been quite high. And basically the reason was that the tenants had to pay the landlord. The landlord didn't have money. And in order to build an office building, the tenants had to give the landlord the money in order to build the building. And so that was the idea. But that most companies, of course, built their own office building. They built their own buildings. But that if you were a little company and you needed office space, you had to go to find somebody who owned land and go to that person and say, here's and collect a group of people that have money and to say, we need this office building, build us an office building. So that was how that worked. So land became the most valuable thing to own. So the only way you could borrow money was to own land. So in order to borrow more money, you had to buy land. So think about what's happening. It's just very simple. Your and there was little incentive to sell, because the capital gains tax, the gains on the increase in the value of the land were heavily taxed. So because of that, there was much incentive to buy, little incentive to sell. Your demand curves were shifting out. If you were shifting out, supply is basically basically fixed. So the supply is more like this. So what happened is the value of the land increased, and it continually increased. And in fact, between 1945 and 1990, that 45 years, the land prices never dropped. So, and it was continually forced up by the fact that in order to borrow money, you had to own land. So when the bubble economy came, or when the banks were told to lend, there wasn't enough. The manufacturers really didn't need all that money. They didn't really need it, but nobody knew that at the time. Everybody thought they did, but they didn't. Now there's all this excess money. The banks they're literally going around. What they did during the 1980s, a lot of the little office buildings around town were built then, that people lived in houses. They were houses, they went to them and they said, here's money, build an office building, everybody wants so they borrowed the money, and because they own the land. So money started going into the real estate market, because in order to borrow money, you had to own land. But so the demand, it increased, it even caused a greater increase in the demand for land. So the money is, so then people are just buying land in order to be able to borrow money cheaply. That's part of the story. So the other part of the story is that in the Japanese stock market at the time, the value of the companies the profits were very low. They had very low profits. And the price of Japanese stocks on the Tokyo and Osaka stock exchanges was from the land that they owned. So as the value of the land went up, the value of the companies went up. So the more money came in, the banks are lending money, people are borrowing money to buy land, the value of the land goes up, then the value of the companies are going up. People are seeing the value of the companies rise, now they're buying the companies. So they're buying the stock is rising dramatically, the land is rising dramatically. It set off an explosion, an absolute incredible explosion. And if you go to page 113, this tells you what happened. The Plaza Accord is 1985, so it's right in here. This was at the commercial and all land, the value of commercial land in Tokyo. This is the official land prices. It went up almost 3.5 times in central Tokyo from 1983 to 1991. And this short period, this 3 or 4 years, absolute explosion in prices. And actually in Osaka it was even greater. There was an even greater increase in land prices. Now if you went to the smaller cities, this didn't really take place much. This was almost entirely a phenomenon, largely of Tokyo and Osaka, a little bit less in Nagoya, maybe a little bit in places like Fukuoka, but in much of the rest of the country, the increases were quite modest. But what happened? So what you had this explosion of land prices. The stock market did the same thing. Stock market's exploding, the land prices are exploding, and also as a part of that now, Japanese investors are now going all over the world, and they're tons of money. The yen is rising in value. People are borrowing money, and because the yen was continually increased, and the yen is also going up during this period, people are borrowing money, and basically at negative interest rates, because if they're borrowing in yen, and then they're going investing outside of Japan, and then the yen keeps on rising, they have to pay back that loan, it's cheaper. It was actually cheaper to borrow. The effective interest rate was negative. So the money was free. So money was free. When money is free, people get a lot of it and do silly stuff with it. And a lot of silly stuff happened as a result of it. It had an impact on the entire world economy. So no, this was a major event. So the problem is that by the time that the financial authorities realized that they had a problem, and that was in late 1989. It was too late. But by the time that the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan realized that they had a real serious problem, it was too late. By then, and what they did was they began rising interest rates. And if you look on page 114, you can see 1989, and they start rising short-term interest rates. It was like 3.5%, and just in the space of a few months, it goes up to 7%. So short-term interest rates rise very dramatically. They're just to try to cut the bubble off. Well, it did work. It did work, and the Nikkei peaked at December 31st, 1989, at 38,916. It's never been anywhere near that since. It started dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping in the early 1990s. If you're interested in this period, I'm sure there's plenty of books written in Japanese about it. A great book by a foreigner, a fellow named Christopher Wood, on the bottom of page 112. This was somebody who came in and looked around and realized what was going on. And he wrote a book that right around the time that I came to this country in 1992, the book came out, and I realized right away that something very dramatic, and that the world didn't really understand yet what was going to happen. He understood. People in Japan didn't at the time. They didn't understand. They thought that that in a year or two, everything would just adjust. Everything would just go on as before. The economy would grow 4, 5, 6% a year. Land prices would start rising again. Everything was going to be fine. It never was fine. It was an absolute. It was a very, very painful recession. 1990s, very, very difficult period. So that is that's the story. As I say, if you're interested in this period, you could have a class just about that. I could spend an entire class just going over the bubble economy and the aftermath of it. We're looking at major financial crises. The point here is that this was the first real major bubble, global bubble, that appeared after the floating exchange rate. Floating exchange rates came after 1971. The Japanese asset bubble, mid to late 1980s, early 1990s, was the first one. We have seen crises over and over since then. And basically what you've seen since then is a series of bubbles that have been blown up, deflated and blown up and deflated over and over again. And many people argue that we're in another bubble right now, and I think to some degree there's a bit of that. And if you stay around next semester, we'll go through and you'll understand a lot more about that. We won't have time this semester to do that, but I'll be spending quite a bit of time next semester to talk about the current financial crisis, the Great Recession, that we're still seeing the effect of. I think it's ending, but we're still seeing the effects of that. So with that, we'll move on. But this is just really a partial story. The full story it's a long one, but I want to talk about briefly the Asian financial crisis. And the Asian financial crisis actually also involved Japan. Some people may not, they think about it as being a crisis in Thailand, Malaysia, in Indonesia in particular, those countries. But the problem was that Japan was a part of that because the debt that these countries were accumulating came from largely from Japanese banks. There were other foreign investors as well, or foreign investors as well. But the difference was the Japanese banks, and at the time, so the Japanese banks are in financial trouble. The bubble had collapsed. Now they've got all this debt, but they're still running around and lending. They're still running around and lending, and they don't even. And it's in 1997. In 1997, the Japanese banks don't even understand how much problem they have. They still don't even know. They don't understand, and the reason is that they actually had no idea how much debt their borrowers had. They were the borrowers that had borrowed to build for the real estate market during the bubble that couldn't pay back. The banks actually didn't know how much money they'd lent out because all of the records were on paper. The records were all on paper, It was just in filing cabinets, little cards, index cards in filing cabinets, all the records, and nobody at the banks had ever gone through the records. They didn't know. So in 1997, and the banks are lending, the Japanese banks are lending to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and because Japanese companies are now going, and because the yen has gone up in value, the Japanese companies are investing in these countries. So they're investing, they're building large amounts of production capacity. This is, and less in China at that time. The investment boom came later. It was a lot in Indonesia and Thailand. I think somewhat less in Malaysia. Lots of investment in those countries. So the lending is going primarily to Japanese companies that are built, but also in the local economy. And the problem was that the banks were lending in yen, and the loans were priced, were valued in the local currency. The baht, try to remember. So that's the ringgit in Malaysia, and I'm trying to remember the Indonesian currency. But it was in local currency. The currency had gone up in value because investors are pouring into the market. International investors in 1997 realized that the Thai baht was overvalued, and they started putting pressure on the Thai baht, and they forced the value of the Thai baht to drop, and this spread to all these other currencies. But all these other currencies, in the short hot money, especially Western money, the Western money was all hot, and they got out right away. So the Westerners got out of these countries. The Japanese banks were stuck. The currencies drop in value, which means the value of they can't pay back, the value of the loans plunges, and the Japanese banks, do you know what hedging is? To hedge. You've heard of a hedge fund? To hedge means that you offset, when you have a risk, you take an action to reduce the risk if something happens. To reduce currency risk, you can do what's called a hedge. And the hedge means you can buy another instrument that protects you if the value of the currency changes. So if the value of the currency goes the wrong way, you can reduce your losses with a hedge. Again, this is complicated stuff. This is for a finance class. I don't have time to go into that. But the important point here is that the banks did not hedge. The banks had unhedged loans to these developing countries. The currencies absolutely collapsed in value. They've lost tremendous value. The loans became almost worthless. The loans suddenly became worthless, and the banks then lost all their money. So they basically had been hurting. The Japanese banks had been hurting as a result of the Japanese bubble. When 1997 came and the Asian financial crisis, it was a disaster. The Japanese banking system was insolvent. Insolvent means they had no money. They really were completely, the value of the Japanese banking system when the Asian financial crisis happened was zero. It had no value. That literally was, it was a real crisis. Now, just to go over, to give you a sense on page 115, and I've got these several pages, to show you what happened in terms of the overall debt that these countries took on, that they were developing rapidly, so it looked like it was okay for them to take on debt. And the problem is, and what you want to focus on is the short-term debt. This is a percentage of what's called gross national income. It's similar to gross net domestic product, gross national GDP, GNP, GNI. They're a little bit different. They're usually fairly similar, but for some reason that was the data and how it was organized. But the point here is that you want to look at the short-term debt, and whenever you see a financial crisis, happens, it's when short-term debt rises. Short-term, everybody gets so excited, the people in the markets get excited, they start bidding up the value of assets, they're borrowing money, and the banks and the lenders are typically lending short-term. And so short-term, and this is a really good sign, you'll see here, Thailand, the short-term debt as a percentage of the gross national income, 18, 20, 26, 20, almost 27, 27.5. This was the build-up to the crisis. And then when that money left, then the debt that drops because the economy just collapses. And you'll see this is nominal GDP. This is look at what happened to the Thai economy, 1997, 1998. That's a 17% drop in 1997, 26% drop, almost 27% drop. That's massive. That means that you would have gone from 100 to 83 to about 60. About maybe 58, 59. So basically, the economy shrank by 40% in 2 years. This was a crisis, a real crisis. Indonesia had a very similar thing. It didn't have as much. Thailand had just money was poured into, short-term money. Thailand was the real, and that's where the crisis started because there was so much short-term debt. And when that got out, when those investors realized that there was a real problem, they got out, and it caused the value of the currency to collapse. Indonesia was less of a, but they took on a lot of overall debt. This was Indonesia. Of course, the increases in 1998 is because the nominal GDP dropped so much. And look at that drop. 1 year in Indonesia, 57% drop in nominal GDP. Massive economic decline, massive decline. There, the short-term debt was not as much of a problem, but it was some significant. Malaysia was less of a problem. The crisis was, it suffered as well, but not as much. Now again, I'm presenting this to you. Last year I had a student that did a paper, their presentation on the Asian financial crisis in Thailand. So that's certainly a very interesting. It's a very interesting topic, and if you really want to understand, and to really clearly understand what's going on in this country in the past 25 years, it is important to understand the Asian financial crisis. The Asian financial crisis essentially forced Japan to modernize its economy. It basically forced a tremendous change in the Japanese economy, and beginning with the real estate market, and which I participated in. I was certainly I was a part of that. A part of that change in the years after 1997, so, and especially for the next 10 years after that. But that was the crisis of 1997 forced forced to change. And then as a result of that, people in Japan realized that they weren't going back to the era before the bubble. That was never coming back. At any rate, the important themes to remember when you see financial crises is one, you see too much lending. You see that in the Japanese bubble. You see that in the Asian financial crisis. It happened in several smaller crises in the late 1990s. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s in the United States. The real estate the real estate bubble around the world, and especially in the United States, but globally in the early 2000s, early and mid 2000s. Always excessive lending. Excessive lending is always something that when you have financial crises, you always see excessive lending. A lot of it, excessive cross-border lending. Everybody gets excited about economic growth in another country, and everyone is rushing in. Investors are rushing in with investment money. We saw that in Asia crisis, especially in Indonesia and Thailand. You saw it there was a Russian financial crisis. You saw that in Russia. You've seen that in Turkey. And then, of course, in the 2000s, in the 2000s, it became basically a global excessive lending and borrowing. Along with excessive lending is excessive short-term loans, short-term lending. Lenders are worried about getting their money back, and that also shows you the lenders are starting to get worried because they now want short-term loans. But when people are borrowing, and one of the problems with short-term lending is that it's easy to pull all that lending out very quickly. So and that's what we call hot money. Hot money, it goes in, it's hot, it leaves. It can cause prices to go, asset prices to zoom and collapse. That's hot money. Another one is lending to businesses and projects with low rates of return. Most crises, you see that. You see you saw that in the Japanese asset bubble, late 1980s. Banks are lending to projects that had actually extremely low rates of return. You saw that in the Asian financial crisis. You saw it you see that in every crisis. Another important thing is the lack of regulatory supervision. That is, the financial authorities are either not aware or the financial authorities it should have been making money more, increasing interest rates, making money more expensive, making it more difficult for money to flow cross-border. Those were the things that they could have done. Monitoring the banks, telling the banks not to lend too much. The regulators, and we've seen this in many countries, in many crises, over and over again in the last 30 years, a lack of regulatory supervision. And as part of that, the lack of regulatory supervision went along a belief by the financial authorities that the lending was not too excessive. They thought that it was not too much. They thought it was okay. They thought there wasn't really a problem. And finally, and we have seen again, over and over again, in many cases, the parties that caused the crisis in the first place, the banks and the investment banks that created the problems in the first place were the ones that got bailed out. They got money from the governments, poured money into the banks, and and the investment banks and commercial banks to rescue them, because having a financial crisis caused an impact on the real economy. The problem is that it's like going out and spending wasting all of your money, and then saying, borrowing money, wasting it all, throwing it all away, stupidly wasting it, and then saying, well, I need money or else the economy can't function. And so the government's giving them more money. Well, as you can easily imagine, the parties that cause the problem, that then get bailed out, are going to go to the next problem, and they're going to cause the next problem. We've seen that over and over again. These are very important issues, and these are very important themes that the world is still struggling to deal with. And so the interesting thing is these crises aren't over yet. We're at the end of this one, but I think that the asset prices are both stocks and the real estate in the United States certainly I think is overpriced. I think that the value of the assets are too high. It's artificial. You're going to have a correction. And so I think we've seen another bubble. We're still in these kind of crises, and the ultimate problem very likely is, because I've said since 1971, this is something that seems to be coming because of floating exchange rates, because of free trade, because of free flow of capital. So globalization, free flow of capital, free flow of trade, these bubbles that keep on blowing up and keep blowing up and bursting, they keep on happening over and over again. It seems to be a part of the floating exchange rate system. So that's an overview of financial crises. We'll move away from that, and we'll turn to page 119, because we're, and certainly part of this class, there's a lot of very interesting subjects. We're just kind of going through each of these subjects. And the idea here is, of course, for you, is to get ideas. I want you to get ideas for your own research, introduce topics, and then have you go off and do your own research and learn more about that area. And so I'm having these lectures are designed to stimulate your interest in terms of that. And I also want to mention that I'm going to have, probably Saturday, I'll send you a midterm assessment. I don't worry about it, but I'm going to give you the whole week to do it. Much of it there'll be some questions just to go over some of the material that I've presented, so that you can just kind of mentally review the topics that we've studied so far. But also I want to start seeing what you want the research that you want to do. I want you to start putting down what your research is. I think you've made some good starts in terms of thinking about some topics. You've done a little bit of initial work. You're gaining some tools. I want you now to just jot down, begin to think about a topic that you're interested in, and I'll include that as part of the assessment. Your midterm assessment will be to see where you start thinking about where you are in terms of your final presentation. As I say, I don't want you to worry about this. This is it's not a test in the same way that you're going to get in other subjects, but I do want you to work hard on it and just go over the material and think about what some topics that you're interested in. As I say, I'm quite pleased overall with what people are the progress that you're making. I'll see your assignments that you've turned in this week. So that's the direction the class is going. As part of that, or as part of the, as we're talking about the flow of capital, we're going to turn to a very important part of capital flows, of international capital flows, and that is direct foreign investment, foreign direct investment, and that is the value. It's inward direct investment made at the. This is the World Bank's definition. It's non-residential investors, so investors that that are not residents in a country. They're investing in another country, and they're actually investing their capital in another country. That's called foreign direct investment. So it's from residents of an economy to an external economy. So it includes liabilities and assets transferred between resident direct investment enterprises, direct investors. These are just kind of definitions. The purpose is so that you understand who controls the money. So we have to understand who's making the investment, where is the money coming from, who controls the money, who controls the companies that the investment is being made. Investment is typically made in companies. Who's controlling the assets, the investment capital that's being made. So this is kind of just an overview of a definition of what foreign investment, direct investment is. You'll want to go to that. Just if you get interested in this topic, you'll want to understand that in more detail. The idea is that it's equity that gives rise to control or influence. So equity is being injected from a foreign investor into a company outside of their own country that's giving them control or interest. And it can be debt. Debt is also is considered a form of is generally considered a form of direct foreign direct investment. So when we look at the data on foreign direct investment, this describes how what foreign direct investments mean. Now we're going to do, and for the rest of this class, we're going to go over, we're going to study the flow of foreign direct investment. These are, I've used data that's, there's various sources. The World Bank has estimations, and also the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, as well as official national sources. So I've used various sources in order to put these maps together to give you a flavor for the flow of foreign investment capital from and to countries. And I've done this for the 2010 to 2014 period. And the total the average outward investment was 1.4 trillion. That's $1,453 billion. That's 1.4 trillion. 1.4, almost 1.5 trillion dollars. That would be about 180 trillion yen. It's a lot of money. So it's significant. It's maybe 3-4% of global GDP. So as a percentage of global GDP, it's it would be about let's see. It'd be about 1/3, 33% of Japan GDP. So it's a lot of money. This is a lot of money that's flowing between countries. Now, a certain part of that also with something we'll come up with the topic of offshore tax haven. These are ways that people get around paying taxes in their home country. Some of this is legal, some of it is illegal, but it's called offshore tax haven, and that flow is about 23% of the foreign direct investment flow. So a part of foreign direct investment is actually capital that's just trying to escape taxes, and it's flowing from one country to another. It's not real investment. It could be, but generally it's not. It's actually just money that's trying to avoid taxes. So you have to, when you look at the foreign direct investment figure, you have to realize that some portion of this, and about 24%, is in fact money that's flowing from countries to other countries just to escape taxes in their home, to a jurisdiction, to a country or a jurisdiction with lower taxes. And as we'll see, these are places, some well-known places, places like the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, Singapore, Mauritius, Panama. You've heard of Panama. That was a scandal. That's another country. Luxembourg. Luxembourg is very famous. To some degree, Hong Kong acts as a bit of a tax haven. Certainly Singapore, as I mentioned earlier. We'll talk more about that later. I think next time we'll go into that subject. But just to know that is a part of foreign direct investment, and we'll be talking. Let's see, how much am I going to go over? Yeah, here is the offshore tax haven flows. And these are countries, and I had at least one student that did this, that talked about this last year, to give you an idea of these flows. I mentioned British Virgin Islands, that's BVI. Lots of companies, it's a little place. Globally, people go and set up companies there in order to avoid taxes. Hong Kong is the world's biggest offshore tax haven. That's probably in part where China doesn't really want to make. China has both wants it to be part of China and yet to stay a little bit outside, because in fact it's an important tax haven. It's an important haven for rich Chinese to get their money out of the country. Singapore has become a very important financial center and tax haven. I mentioned Luxembourg. Ireland is actually quite important. It's a corporate tax haven in Europe. A lot of high-tech companies, American high-tech companies, have invested a lot of money. Some of it's in real production, and some of it's just to avoid taxes. Another very important country as a tax haven is the Netherlands. The Netherlands, for example, Japan has a bilateral treaty. The Netherlands has a number of countries, including Japan, a bilateral treaty of zero tax so you can structure a transaction in Japan that if it's related to a company in the Netherlands, if there's enough of a financial trend, then you can structure it as taking place in the Netherlands, and the tax is zero, even if on the activity. When the activity is earning a profit on their investment in, say, in Japan, and the entity is in the Netherlands, the tax rate is zero. And so there's a lot of games that have been played with that country. Some of it is just at one time people were doing real estate deals and claiming that the investor was Netherlands based, and so therefore there was no taxes. It didn't work very well, but people try. They always try. So these are the ways that these countries. Switzerland, of course, is very famous. Switzerland is a famous place for money to disappear to. It has traditionally been a haven. I remember years ago going to a bank, going to a Swiss bank, and the banker saying to us that said this is like a church. In other words, it's secret. If you tell, whatever you bring, we will never tell anybody. This is like a church. In other words, a church in Western church, especially Roman Catholic, if you tell your sins, the priest cannot tell anybody. So if you bring your sins to your sins to Switzerland, they would say, we're like a church. We don't tell anybody. That's changed. That has changed, but still Switzerland is an important center for offshore tax haven. Cayman Islands is in the Caribbean. That's a very famous place. Malta, then some of these others, you saw Panama, I mentioned Cyprus, Liechtenstein, Isle of Man. Isle of Man is related to Britain. Lots and lots of offshore tax funds. And lots of other activity that are based in the Isle of Man. That's UK entity. Liechtenstein's a little tiny country next to Switzerland in Europe. There's like less than 30,000 people. It's a very, very well-known tax haven. So these are very interesting, and as I say, there's a lot of both legal and illegal activity that's involved with this. So I had a student that did their research last year on tax havens. So this is an interesting, very interesting topic. In terms of overall foreign direct investment, both outflow and inflow, the United States is a huge source, and this was in the 2010-2014. In that period, there was a huge outflow of capital from the United States, whereas Japan, it was almost all outflow. Japan in the 2010-2014 was a very unattractive place for international investment. International investors were in general pulling their money out of Japan during that period. China, on the other hand, the second largest inflow of foreign direct investment, but also a lot of outflow, a lot of Chinese money looking to escape government controls. Some of it is money that the elites have earned, and some of it's and a lot of some of it may be illegal activity. The elites are always worried about getting arrested. Even if you can be an elite in China one day and tomorrow you get arrested. That if you follow events in China, that happens almost on a weekly basis. Some figure is arrested almost constantly. Well-known figure or wealthy figure is arrested constantly there. So people are trying to spend a lot of energy to get their money out. Other companies are putting money in because it's a big economy. It's an interesting situation. Germany is in general more outflow of capital. The same with Russia because of their oil revenues. Canada, both in and out. And again, Canada, because it's a large resources, it is a wealthy country. France, Italy, Korea, and Spain are also significant sources of inflows and outflows of foreign direct investment. But the most important, United States, China, in terms of, especially inflow, outflow, has been China, Japan. The Japan situation changes, but this era there was very little inflow and a lot of outflow. Now we're going to go continent by continent, and we're going to begin with outward foreign direct investment. And what we're going to show you is we're going to get a sense of which direction does the money flow, so this is as a percentage of the world average per capita, so per person, outward foreign direct investment. And needless to say, most African countries have very little investment capital to begin with. And not surprising, they're at or near the bottom of the world. And this is about as dark a red as you can get on this picture. And you'll see the huge areas. There's a few exceptions. Angola is a little bit lighter pink. South Africa is a little bit lighter. That's Liberia. There's Togo a little bit. Libya a little bit of an exception. And Gabon, but otherwise it's very, very deep red. Europe, on the other hand, has some, and some of them are not surprising. We've talked about Norway, for example. Norway, we've shown it has a large balance of payment surplus. It exports a lot of oil. It is a tremendously wealthy country in terms of natural resources, especially petroleum. It's one of the world's significant exporters of petroleum. It has a very, very small population. It's less than 10 million people. I think it's about 8 million, maybe 7 million or so, something like that. And they have a lot of money, and it's got to go somewhere. There's more money than they need. It's a major source of outward flows. Switzerland is also, and again, this is money that goes into the country as a tax haven and then turns around and goes back out. So that's where some of this you can begin to identify some of the tax havens. Some of the tax havens. Some of it is a result of, some of this is the result of, like Norway. That's the result of their riches, their wealth, natural resource wealth. Sweden is probably very similar. Sweden is probably Denmark. These have to do with that, but certainly Switzerland is because of tax haven, money flowing in and out. And again, this is just looking at outward flow. That's Ireland. The same reason. Ireland is a tax haven for companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, you name all the Facebook, all have set up operation. A lot of pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies will actually make things in Ireland, so they actually do. There's a lot of production of pharmaceuticals in Ireland, but these others are just, they set up an operation, shift profits to Ireland, and then get taxed at a lower rate. It's a 15% tax rate. It's the same as Singapore. Then the money flows back out, and that's why that's dark blue. It's not because people in Ireland are saving so much money, and it's because of it's a tax haven. You see that little blue right there? See under there in Central Europe? Right there? Anybody know what that country that is? It's a little tiny country. It's Luxembourg. Luxembourg is it's smaller, I think, than Tokyo-to. It's actually smaller than Tokyo-to, about a population of about 1 million. It used to be a manufacturing center. Now it is a banking center, so that's that there. Then you have countries like Hungary. That's Czech. It's Austria. Austria, Netherlands, and Belgium. Eastern Europe, very little out. We've shown negative balance of payments. Remember, if you go back to that map is red. They're lagging economies. They're developing economies in general. So they have little outward. Not surprising they have little outward FDI. In North America, in terms of outward FDI, Canada and the US both have positive outward flow, per capita outward flow. Mexico is a poorer country, less money for, it's still a developing country. There's a lot of investment opportunities in the country. There's less investment outside of the country in general. That is the source of the data that I got right there. That's the logo, and you go to that site. It's a great site, wonderful site. If you're interested in foreign direct investment, that's one of the first places you're going to go to. to find information on that. Again, it's like a lot of things that are associated with the United Nations. The sites that I've shown you, you can get that data someplace else, but you just have to work 100 times harder. It's all in one. It's all in one place. Very, very conveniently collected. So a very convenient site. If you're interested in foreign direct investment, that is a must site to go to. Australia it's a wealthy country, but there is a lot of investment opportunity in it. Investors tend to, suggest that investors in general tend to invest within Australia, particularly in the mining sector. There's a lot of mining in Australia. South America is very interesting because we keep on seeing Chile come up as an exception. That's on page 128. Chile is a real exception. All the others, and Chile is relatively more wealthy. It has, if I recall correctly, you'll find positive balance of payment, so that you would expect that that's not surprising. There's a lot of goods and particularly resources to sell to the rest of the world. Relatively small population, but the rest of South America, relatively little, especially countries in the center of the continent: Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. In particular, those are countries that are developing, or a lot of investment opportunity within the country. People don't feel the need to invest abroad. There's plenty of attractive investments inside of many of these countries. Asia, interestingly, you'll see China a little bit lighter. That means that they do have some outward investment. We've noticed, I've shown you, it's very large on a world basis, but because China has such a large population, it's still well below average, but not near the bottom, as we see countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, in South Asia there, but also Indonesia, Philippines, all of the Southeast Asian, Indochina countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Exceptions are Thailand. Thailand has become a reasonably wealthy, relatively wealthy country compared to some of the surrounding countries. Malaysia's in this very similar state. If you look at Singapore, you'll see that little tiny dot at the bottom of the Malaysian peninsula there. You'll see that little dark blue dot is Singapore. I think that's the number one it's right near the top of the world in terms of net outflow. But again, Singapore is a tax haven. It's a tax haven. So money is pouring in, money's flowing out. And bankers love that, so there's lots of banks in Singapore. And chances are, if you do get into the banking business, you may go work in Singapore, who knows? If you learn English, there's a lot of Japanese with English language skills getting jobs in very, very nice paying jobs in Singapore. So keep that in mind. Notice how Japan has a net outflow as well. Japan still invests a lot. There's quite a bit of investment abroad. Japanese companies do a lot of manufacturing outside of Japan. So as part of that, they invest outside of Japan. That's both manufacturing, agriculture, as I've mentioned before. Much of the agricultural imports are actually produced, or a fair bit of it is produced by Japanese-owned farms, at least in some countries. South America, Philippines, Thailand. You would have that kind of situation. So you see that Japan is above average. The Middle East, not surprising, you'll see the very dark Qatar. If you've been following the tensions in over Qatar, it's not resolved, but it seems like the tensions are a little bit eased. And in fact, Qatar is the world's largest exporter of natural gas. I knew they were important, but now I've checked it. They're the largest exporter of liquid natural gas, and Japan is a major customer. So it's certainly, they're still concerned, but it's certainly good to see that at least the crisis seems to be somewhat less. That's Kuwait. So those two little countries have lots and lots of money. There's not much to invest in, even though there's plenty to invest in. But the production is so great. The production of energy is so great in those two countries that there's very large amounts of per capita outward FDI. Israel again also that way. Israel, prosperous country that invests, and part of that for Israel is geopolitical. It's interesting to note that they do. Israel is one of those countries, and I think it's fair to say Taiwan is in the same situation. They have to buy friends, so part of their investment is to buy friends. In the rest of the world, Israel invests a lot in Africa, for example, and to try to keep African countries friendly to them. Taiwan, to some degree, you have the same situation. Much of the rest of the Middle East is dark red. Obviously, Iran is not investing money anywhere anytime soon. Iraq, for the same reason. Syria, that's pretty easy to understand. That's Yemen. To some degree, you can see it's a part of these are countries that have conflicts or other problems with the rest of the world. Now we're going to talk about inward FDI, and this is a very interesting map for Africa, because now we're talking about inward FDI, not outward. This is relative to the average per capita. So the thing to remember here is that the African countries in general are below average per capita GDP, and yet most of the continent gets well below average per capita in inward investment. The problem is they're not necessarily very attractive countries, or they're difficult countries to invest in. The center right there is the Central African Republic. That's an example, a lot of conflict there. That little country I got my finger pointed out, that's Burundi. Burundi, there's a lot of problems in that country. Some of these though they're a little bit lighter. The interesting thing is this is Democratic Republic of Congo. There's lots and lots of problems. The thing about the Democratic Republic of Congo is that there's so much mineral wealth there that people are just willing to risk it. There's so much valuable minerals that even though the country has massive problems, people are willing to take the risk, some risk to invest in that country. We've talked about Zambia. That's a little bit lighter pink. Mozambique, we haven't said anything about. That's an interesting one. I don't understand. That's a country that I can't say that I know a lot about what's going on there. Anybody is interested in that, might be an interesting topic to look into as to why Mozambique seems to be attracting capital. Do you remember what I mentioned about Djibouti? That little country right there? Remember that last week? I just want to make sure everybody can see what I'm looking at. See that? That country right there. That little tiny, that's Djibouti. I'm sure you can see that right there. That's Djibouti. And I'm sure most people have never heard of it. And as I mentioned to you, it's actually a very important country because of its, there are important the international naval bases that are there. And those naval bases are monitoring and protecting global trade, global traffic. So it's important for them to be there because there's a lot of instability in the countries around, particularly Somalia, and there's been a lot of piracy, particularly out of Somalia over the last 15 years or so, maybe more. And so as a result, it's important for the world's navies to have a base here. The other thing is it's important because it's near the Middle East. And so in order for the United States, countries like the United States, France, and Britain to have a presence in the Middle East, it's important to have a naval base in a secure country. And so Djibouti is actually that secure, relatively stable country. So that's why that's a little bit, quite a bit lighter. It's almost pink. That's a reflection of that. And as I mentioned, you may recall, and I'll repeat it, I think it's worth repeating, China is setting up its a naval base in Djibouti. And as I mentioned, one of the positive aspects of that is that this will allow United States and Chinese military, the Chinese military, to be in close contact. It's actually, people think it's quite positive that China and the United States, if there's any problems between the two countries, that's probably the first place will be the relationships that those two countries will be developing through having the naval ports there is, if anything, is probably a positive. It's a little interesting detail, but I think it's important to mention in this class. Namibia is a place of a fair bit of mineral wealth, diamonds, gold. The same with Botswana. It's a lighter pink, but it's a little bit below average, but it is a relatively wealthy country, and it has a lot of, it's one of the world's significant sources of diamonds. Mentioned Zambia. There's Ghana, a little bit lighter. That's somewhat attractive right there. Liberia has become more attractive. There's some mineral wealth in Mauritania. That's where that comes from. Well, that's what we've gotten to. Let's see, what page 131. Let's see. Okay, I've got quite a bit. Got 20 more pages, so I think, we'll be going over this next, we'll finish this up next time. And then I'll take a look. I may need to, we'll probably have to skip over some material that I presented last year, but that's okay. I'm not concerned about that. What I want to see, and it'll be very helpful for you when you lay out your some topic that you may wish to do for your presentation. That'll help me also if you're interested in particular countries. I can focus on those countries to help you along, to give you some better ideas, and also on topics, so we can go over. That'll help me, especially with a small class like this. It'll be easy for me to focus my lectures on topics that you're interested in. I'm certainly going to be talking. You did your exercise about India. India is a very interesting country, and I'll be talking. One of my lectures will be definitely about India. I don't know if I'll have time to. I'm planning to talk about China. Definitely going to talk about India. There's some fascinating stuff that's gone on this year, from late last year and this year. Some very interesting developments in that country. That's one of the reasons why I had you do that exercise. I want you to get some familiarity with India. It's really, really interesting things going on in that country. So that's where we are. As I say, probably send you Saturday, maybe Sunday. I'll try to get it to you on Saturday, but it may be Sunday. Your midterm assessment. I'll give you the rest of the time. There's nothing to study for. I'll just want you to. If there's anything, I'll refer you to where you need to look up this information, and otherwise, then I'll want you to start thinking, and as part of that, to start thinking about your final presentation. So thank you. And you'll need to. You saw my comment about that is just simply. Very complicated to understand that industry. That data just simply, you could do it, but you'd have to. It would be a very extensive study. It's just too much, I think, for you to try to do at this stage of your studies. That's all.